The Holy Gospel according to Luke. Now, as Jesus and the disciples went on their way, he entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks, so she came to him and asked, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work for myself? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." The Gospel of Jesus Christ.
Praise to you, O Christ.
How many of you would admit you might be a perfectionist? Oh man, just 3, 4 of us? Wow. Yes. You know, someone was just standing here without one, and spread is really high. I'm not going to. I'm sorry. So just so you know, King County is looking at reinstating mask mandates. It's spread is they're having 21 new hospitalizations a day. Those aren't people getting sick. Those are people being hospitalized. When I went to the hospital to visit someone in Puyallup last week, there were people all over the place with COVID that were in the tents and in the waiting room. Please be careful. Especially when you're dealing with someone like me from outside the area. The same variants aren't in the same places, so we can really mix it up. So, back to being perfectionists. There's, well, let me ask it this way. How many of you would say that there's usually more to be done than there is time to do it in? Yeah, whole bunch of us. So we do have some closeted perfectionists here. How about anyone who tends to overcommit? Yeah, see? Ever feel anxious and distracted? Yeah. This morning's gospel lesson was written with us in mind. And I want to give you some context here. You know how maybe my son would do something, and I would say, let me tell you a story about your great-grandpa. This is how we pass on family values, right? And it's how we pass on community values. We tell the stories of the heroes. And the people who were close to Jesus, who were part of his inner circle, served in that role for early Christian communities. So, who are some of those people?
The disciples?
Yeah. Who were some of the people that were part of Jesus' inner circle? Can you think of particular names?
Mary Magdalene.
Mary Magdalene? Uh-huh. And maybe Peter? And so, what would happen? I'm just going to use Peter as an example because I blurted that one out. Peter was steadfast and organized the early church, and yet we have a whole bunch of stories of Peter doing something wrong or idiotic. But think about this. During the time that the Gospels were written, not Mark so much, but later, persecutions had begun in earnest, and there were people who would say, under duress, say, oh, no, I don't follow Jesus, no. And then they would feel bad about it, and they needed to be reconciled with the community. So it must have been really helpful to them to hear the story of Peter's betrayal. Oh, Peter betrayed Jesus 3 times and was accepted back. So it must be something that grace must be there for me too. So when we hear these stories, the stories that are included and the way they're told, it was for the first readers, the first hearers of those stories. Mary and Martha were part of that inner circle. So this is just one of the stories that the gospel writers tell about Martha and Mary. In another story, Martha engaged Jesus in a theological conversation and argued with him and even felt comfortable telling him off. It's your fault, Jesus. I mean, okay, so we have different stories, but in this story, when Martha heard that Jesus was in town, she welcomed him to stay at the home she shared with her sister Mary. Now, a group of people would have been traveling with Jesus. So having Jesus stay at their house would likely mean having a lot of people over. So right away, she got busy readying the house and preparing a meal. Those are things we do when we suddenly find out a group of people is coming over. She was just as excited about, Mary was just as excited about having Jesus as their guest. But when Jesus arrived, Mary abandoned the preparation of the meal to sit at Jesus' feet and learn from him. In their culture, it was traditional for a disciple, male disciples specifically, to sit at the teacher's feet during periods of instruction. So it would have been shocking that Jesus invited her there and shocking that she did it. Sitting at a teacher's feet wasn't a passive role. And I want you to remember that. Sitting at a teacher's feet wasn't a passive role, but would have involved lively discussion and debate. Lively discussion and debate. And I'm going to remind you of that later, so keep that in mind. And Mary didn't hesitate to jump right in along with the men. Few people, let alone women, would have an opportunity like Mary had. Martha was every bit as much Jesus' disciple and every bit as much his friend. She knew the kind of life he led, knew that he'd be tired and hungry, knew that others would likely to be over to visit when they learned he was staying with her and Mary. She'd invited Jesus into her home and set about responding to his needs because she felt compassion for him. She wanted to have him to have the opportunity to rest a bit and enjoy a good meal. And she was anxious about doing a good job. But imagine it wasn't long before Martha realized that Mary wasn't really going to help her with the meal. I can easily imagine that Martha was there in the kitchen, and as her resentment grew, banging the pots around just a little louder and a little louder, not that any of us would ever have done anything like that. But banging pots maybe louder and louder as she got more frustrated and resentful, hoping that Mary would get the hint, and Mary so absorbed in what she was learning from Jesus that she didn't even notice. And as Martha worked to prepare the meal, her focus shifted from Jesus' need for a good meal and a chance to relax to her own need to show him the kind of hospitality he deserved, and her growing resentment that she was doing all the work by herself. Eventually, her frustration and resentment boiled over. Notice she didn't address Mary directly. She didn't say to Mary, hey, come help me. Instead, she burst into the room where Jesus was teaching and tried to triangulate him. This is one of the best examples we have in Scripture of triangulation. Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Has anybody in this congregation ever complained to someone else instead of the person they were upset with? No. Right? But Jesus knew both sisters really well. He responded calmly, Martha, Martha, you're anxious and pulled in many directions. There's really only one thing you need to be concerned with. It's Mary who's chosen the better part. It's not to be taken from her. Now, you'll notice, first of all, I just want to throw something in, and that is, in our tradition, it is the people of the church who are the worker bees. I mean, it bothers me how I've heard this preached growing up, because it is the people in the pews who are the worker bees, and the pastor who is paid to sit at the feet of Jesus. And that's awkward that then that person is standing there saying, well, condemning the people who are doing the work that needs to be done. That is way off base. So let me tell you what I noticed. Jesus never sent anyone in the kitchen to ask Martha to join them. Jesus didn't send someone to say, Martha, you're wasting your time in there. Come on out here with the rest of us. He knew what Martha was doing was necessary, and that she was using her gifts in his service. There was actually nothing at all wrong with her preparing a meal or seeing to the comfort of the guests. In fact, Jesus was all about feeding people and teaching his followers how to feed others. Jesus helped Martha recognize, though, what was really going on for her. She was a compassionate and giving person, but she'd become so caught up in her busyness, so pulled in different directions, that she was filled with anxiety. She had no time for a discussion that might lead her into deeper relationship with God. No time to take a break. No balance. Moreover, she'd become so anxious about making a good impression, her need to do enough, that she wasn't able to give graciously of herself anymore. What had begun as an act of love and compassion had become a requirement for her to feel like she was a good person. And not only was she anxious, she wanted her sister to share in her anxiety. We do that to each other, you know? She was unable to see her sister being a contemplative and a disciple, because her sister was not helping her do what she thought needed to be done so she could feel good about herself. I suspect that many, maybe even most of us, are a lot like Martha a lot of the time. We're very busy people. And those of us who are actively involved in congregations are among the most overcommitted and overburdened. Like Martha, we respond to Jesus' call to discipleship by doing. Luke wants to make it very clear that doing, that is, being the hands and the feet and the voice of Christ in the world, responding with compassion to those around us, it is an essential part of discipleship. That's why this story about Mary and Martha follows immediately the story about the Good Samaritan. So for Luke, those aren't separate. He's just made that point. Now he's making a related point. This is the story about the Good Samaritan. And now let me qualify that by telling you this story about Mary and Martha. You may remember from last week that at the end of the story of the Good Samaritan, Jesus told the lawyer, go and do likewise. Go and do. We're called to be a servant people. But all relationships require care and attention. If we don't take time for our relationship with God through prayer, through Bible study, through worship and contemplation, then, like Martha, we will become anxious about whether we have done enough and pulled in different directions. So, remember what I said about sitting at the feet of Christ, that it's an active thing, that it involves dialogue, that it involves genuine wrestling with stuff. And sometimes it might even involve telling Jesus off, and that's okay. It wouldn't be the first time. And I'm wondering, what would it be like for a congregation, for this congregation, to sit at the feet of Christ? Picture Mary sitting as a disciple near Jesus' feet, listening, discussing, debating, learning. What would it be like if this community of faith made sitting at the feet of Christ its first priority? How might that affect your ministry? I have no doubt that Luke told the story of Mary and Martha just the way he did because there were similar issues in his own community of faith that we have today. Now, 2,000 years later, our lives are becoming infinitely more complicated. Before the pandemic, people worked an average of 10 hours more each week than they had a generation before that. And now they work even more hours. People who used to be careful about boundaries because, they went to work, now text each other at any time of the day and think nothing of it and expect responses. And all those appliances and technology that were supposed to make life easier have only raised our standards and expectations and created anxiety. When I was in college, long ago, either you used the kind of typewriter paper where you took out your special eraser and you could erase a mistake and type over it, or you painted over it and typed over it, but you didn't have to redo the whole stupid thing. So if you had a 60-page paper you were turning in, you weren't looking at reprinting the whole thing and using 3 trees. This is just one example we could probably mostly relate to of ways that our anxiety has been increased by the technology that's supposed to help. It does help in some ways, it's just that anxiety thing is a problem. Imagine how things might have been different for Martha if she'd continued to focus on her love of serving a meal to hungry people, and also what she loved most about her sister. Maybe her single-minded devotion to Jesus, or her audacity in sitting right down there with the men at Jesus' feet. That would have been a different experience for her, wouldn't it? Jesus was very close with both Mary and Martha. They weren't casual acquaintances, they were dear friends. When he spoke to Martha about being anxious and pulled in many directions, he wasn't scolding her, trying to make her feel ashamed, but rather he spoke in love with a real understanding of who she was as a person. We too are in intimate relationship with Christ. This is one of those wonderful open-ended stories. Luke doesn't tell us how Martha responded to what he had to say. Maybe she left everything in the kitchen and ordered pizza and joined Mary at Jesus' feet. Maybe she went back to fixing dinner because she needed that time to think about what Jesus had said. The thing is, Luke leaves the ending of the story open. Because guess what? It's our story as much as it's Martha's story. It's up to us to hear the message and decide what happens next in that story. So how will we respond to Jesus' observations about our behavior? What would it mean for us to sit at Jesus' feet? In our gospel lesson, Jesus is the guest. Today, in this place, we are the guests, and Jesus is the host. And Jesus is inviting us to lay aside our anxieties and distractions as we come to God's table, where we're nourished with the bread of life.